Okay, so let's talk about understanding Flash, and we're going to go through the key principles, and also I'm going to take a look at the impact of camera shutter systems. Because this is a pretty technical presentation, there may be a lot of stuff that you would like to record, but please don't worry too much about writing down too many notes. Jerry has already arranged for a PDF of the presentation to be available, I think, on Facebook. So far better that you sit back and enjoy it. You can get the whole presentation downloaded afterward if you wish. Okay, so the problem with Flash is it's technically complicated. We don't use it very often. And many times when we use it, it doesn't quite come out the way we really want it. And then we get frustrated. And one of those reasons is that many aspects of Flash, in fact, are counterintuitive. For example, the light doesn't fall off linearly. And I'll talk about all of these in more detail. The smaller the source, the harder the light. The closer the source, the darker the background. And on a bright sunny day, why would you ever want to use Flash? Well, it turns out that Flash is very effective to eliminate shadows. So many of us are put off by the fact that we don't understand these technical details. And I hope to go through this evening and give you a better understanding of these details so that you might learn to use Flash and have it improve your photography. First of all, we need to think about the properties of light. Light has four key components. There's the type, the quantity, the quality, and the direction. In the case of the type of light, we can have continuous light, such as sun or flash. We can have natural or artificial light. The quantity for photographers is always that which is sufficient to illuminate the scene as desired. The quality of the light can be cool, it can be warm, it can be soft, and it can be hard. And the direction of light is controlled by where we place the camera, or in the case of Flash, where we place the flash unit. Now, of course, you all know that the perfect exposure is that compromise between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And that's captured very nicely in this exposure triangle. And as we move one of these variables, such as the ISO or the shutter speed, we make changes to our photographs. The advantage of Flash is that it expands the exposure triangle, and that gives us greater possibilities for our photography in general. So why use Flash? Well, for studio work, Flash provides complete control of the lighting. It can freeze motion, it can show motion, it can fill in shadows, and very importantly, it can create an increase in the depth of field. Some of you know the professional photographer Chaz Glatzer. And Chaz has a wonderful expression that says, light illuminates, shadow defines. And that's very well shown in this photograph here, where the flash is clearly off on the left side of the model, as we see, and it's illuminating the left side of his face as we are looking at it, and casts a shadow on the right side. Now, an on-camera flash gives a flat image, but an off-camera flash gives shadow and depth to an image. So if possible, get the flash off the camera. Oops. Okay, let's take a look at the types of flash gear.
Almost lights.
Yeah,
The lights
I
on
didn't
either side of the
know if we
back.
were gonna distract.
The flash gear generally falls into two kinds, which is the so-called on-camera speed lights. Don't always have to be on a camera, obviously. And the so-called studio flash heads or strobes. Now, camera speed lights typically run on AA batteries. They're slow to recharge. They have a low output. They're less expensive, and they have simple modifiers. Strobes, on the other hand, have large power packs. They have fast recharge, have a high light output. They are, of course, more expensive, but you can add a lot of other modifiers, such as soft boxes, snoots, etc. I would like to mention that tonight, because of the time available, I'm not going to talk about studio lighting and studio flash per se, because that's a whole other art. And frankly, we have people who are far more qualified than I who can teach you on that. We have Jim Brady, Nancy Flynn, both of whom use flash on a regular basis and who are experts. Maybe we can get either one of those to give us a workshop in the future. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the principles of flash, such that if we go to do some studio work, it'll be so much easier to see why it works and what doesn't. How do we create a flash? Well, all flashes are created by passing an electric discharge through a gas tube filled with xenon gas. And you need about 350 volts to discharge through a capacitor, and that gives a flash. The speed of creating a second flash is actually limited by the ability to recharge the capacitor. Now, if you have 4 AA batteries, which only give out 1.5 volts each, you can imagine it may take some time to recharge that capacitor. And depending on the flash power required, this actually can take several seconds. Let's talk about flash modes. By and large, there are two kinds, so-called TTL, that's through the lens, or manual flash. TTL is otherwise called eTTL by Canon and other people. And basically, what happens there is that when the flash goes off, it bounces back, and there is a sensor at the camera sensor that measures the flash intensity. And the flash is then turned off when the perfect amount of exposure occurs. So that makes things so much easier, you don't have to guess. So you get perfect exposures, but it can result in a so-called flashed look. Manual flash, on the other hand, allows the photographer to vary the output power. And that gives you much greater latitude to be creative. And of course, that's what we need when we are going to use fill flash, which gets us to the types of flash. Largely, there are two types of flash, one which is called flash as main light, and the other is fill flash. Flash as main light is typically used in studios, but can be done outdoors, and that's where you have full control of the light. On the other hand, fill flash is mostly used outdoors, and it's to open up the shadows. In wildlife photography, we use fill flash to balance the lighting between the subject and the background. So let's talk about some key flash properties. And one of the first ones that's interesting is the size of the light source has a big impact on the light quality. What do I mean by that? If you look at the photograph on the left-hand side, you'll see a large strobe head with a softbox on the front of it. And a softbox gives a big light source. It gives a diffuse, soft wraparound lighting, and that results in soft shadows. Speed lights, on the other hand, those are the the ones usually on camera, are actually a small source, and they give harsh lighting, which results in harsh shadows. So using a diffuser with speedlights can be very helpful. Another key property, or two other key properties, is the intensity of the light and the duration of the flash. And both of these things work together. The graph here shows that the flash goes from 0 to 100% and then decays in a nonlinear manner. It falls off over time. Not surprisingly, the intensity of the light is related to the power of the flash or the strobe. You might be surprised that the duration of the flash also depends on the power of the flash or the strobe. So at maximum power, which is often referred to as 1:1, the typical duration of a flash is about 1/250th of a second. I want you to remember that number because it becomes important later. On the other hand, if we drop the power of the flash down to 128th of the power, the duration of the flash is a fraction of that. It is, in fact, 1/20,000th of a second. And we'll see in a little while why that's important in so-called stop motion flash photography. So here we are talking about the intensity of the flash and the duration of the flash. Now, one of the other key properties about flash is that the light intensity changes with the distance. In other words, the distance between the flash and the subject. And that change in intensity with distance is called light drop-off. The change in intensity is not linear. What do I mean by that? I mean that if we double the distance between the subject and the flash, the light does not go down by half the intensity. Actually, it goes down by 1/4 of the intensity. How could that be? Well, if you think about light from a flash as going out in a cone from left to right, and this first gray circle is a small circle. If we double the distance, which is what the second gray circle represents, in fact, the area covered by the second circle is 4 times the area of the first one, simply as a result of the fact that the area of a circle is pi r squared. So it's not surprising then that the intensity of the light on any area on the second circle is in fact 1/4 of the intensity that it is on the first circle. So even though the density, the distance is doubled, the light intensity is now down by 1/4. So the light drop-off is not linear. If we have a strobe that's placed at a distance of 0, and we measure the intensity at 1 foot, you see on this chart, we're going to call that light at 100%. If it's 100% intensity at 1 foot, in fact, the intensity at 2 feet is 1/4 or 25%. If we double that distance to 4 feet, in fact, the intensity goes down to 1/16th. And if we move out to 8 feet, the intensity drops off to 1/64th. Now, on the other hand, as we move closer and double the distance, we go from 8 feet to 4 feet, the intensity of the light goes up 4 times. And if we move in again to 1/4 of the distance, the intensity of the light increases by 16 times. For those of you who are mathematically inclined, you can see what's called the inverse square law where the light intensity drops off very quickly with distance. But the key thing to remember is it drops off fastest on the first half. In other words, when you decrease the distance by a half. That's going to become important to us here in a few minutes. So as an example of this kind of light fall off, here's a model shot at 3 feet, at 6 feet, and at 12 feet. So we can see the impact keeping the same power, that the intensity of the light is now down to 1/4 in the middle and down to 1/16 power in the third photograph. I'd like to share you with this rather non-intuitive set of photographs, which are more or less the same. And I'd like you to notice the background behind the model. In the one on the left, the background is a sort of off-white. The one in the middle is a gray, and the one on the right is almost black. If I were to ask you, in which of these photographs is the source, is the flash closest to the model? I think most of us would say, well, obviously the one on the left, because there's enough light that goes past the model and it illuminates the background. In fact, it's actually the opposite. If we look at the one in the middle and say that light is close, in fact, the photograph on the left has the light source further away. And the photograph on the right, where the background is dark, has the light closer. How could that possibly be? It's counterintuitive. Well, the reason is that the amount of light needed to illuminate the subject in each case is less. So as we get closer to the model, such as on the right, it needs much less light. And the light falls off quicker behind and goes dark. This is a good example of that through the lens, that TTL effect. Because as we get close to the model, we need less light to illuminate the subject. The sensor detects when there's enough light on the subject and then turns it off. The photograph on the left puts out essentially more light because she's further away, but it's interesting that the background behind her is lit. So one of the key things about flash photography is to make the background go black, move the light source close. How does that impact on our normal photography, for example, in wildlife? Well, here are 2 photographs taken. One was of an eyelash viper in Costa Rica. He was about 5 or 6 feet away. And the second one is of the Antamina chameleon in Madagascar. He's otherwise known as the Jimmy Durante of chameleons. The photograph on the left was taken in broad daylight with a long lens, and the photograph on the right was taken with a macro lens with a ring flash. And then you can see in both cases, although they were taken in broad daylight, the background goes black. So when flash is the main light, your backgrounds will become dark very quickly. So one of the great tools in flash photography, particularly for macro, are ring lights. And the nice thing about the ring light is it goes right over the lens and it fits on most macro lenses. They're about 77 millimeters or so in diameter. And since the distances in macro photography are normally short, the light output is actually very high. And nowadays, these ring lights all are made with LED lights, and they can be used either in flash or continuous mode. You might be surprised to know that, in fact, it's best to use them in continuous mode, because in continuous mode, it's easier to focus on the subject and to see where the shadows fall, so-called modeling light. So with a ring light, you're using flash without the flash. By the way, that Bolt ring light is about $50 from B&H. So they're great lights to have and should be in your bag. So as I mentioned earlier, the closer you are to the subject, the faster the light will fall off. And this is why in most macro photographs, the backgrounds become black. I'm sure many of you have seen what has now become very popular for people who are doing blogs or video logs, where they're using bigger round ring lights, such as the one shown here. The other great technique and piece of equipment to use in flash photography is called the better beamer. The maximum effective distance of most speed lights is really only 8 to 12 feet. For you to get a further distance requires something called a better beamer. And the better beamer is just these two pieces of black plastic that you see are tied with a Velcro onto a speed light. And it has a transparent lens on the front. That lens is a special lens with etched in rings on it, and it's called a Fresnel lens. And it's basically the same principle as lenses in a lighthouse. But a better beamer actually then gives you twice the intensity and will throw the flash out to an effective distance of up to about 25 feet. But a better beamer gives you a small spotlight. It doesn't give you a broad beam. And it's very effective to fill in shadows in bright sunshine, to illuminate a small bird, or to balance the lighting with a bright background when you can't get close to the subject. Here's an example of a better beamer in use on a long lens. And this is one that I use on my back patio. I have a bird feeder that's about 20 feet away from the camera. In this case, you'll see that the flash is not mounted on the camera itself, but is mounted above and forward. And the reason for that is if you mount the flash on the camera, the flash can't see past that long hood. And in fact, you'll get a shadow of the light and won't get the subject illuminated. So the flash is mounted up high and forward. The other thing I'd like you to notice about this setup is that there's a flash cord coming from the speed light on the top down to a little box down at the bottom, and it has some blue lights on it. That's a battery pack. And that battery pack is a lithium high voltage battery pack, and it rapidly recharges the speed light so that when you're using rapid fire, it will rapidly recharge the speed light much faster than it could otherwise be done. So that's the kind of setup that you need to take photographs like these, which are of warblers. And you'll notice that in this case, they're basically full frame, and the subject and the background are evenly lit. So for fill-in flash, we end up with reduced power, but that gives us balanced lighting, which results in a more natural look. In order for us to understand really how flash works, we really need to understand about how the mechanical shutter in our camera works. So I'd like you to watch this video here for a moment, and we're going to see how a shutter actually works.
Now we're looking at the mirror, which is in front of the shutter. When I press down the button, the mirror flips up out of the way, it temporarily blocks the view on it. Then the shutter comes down, whoosh, Now light is exposing on the sensor and then the shutter closes again, followed by the mirror coming back down so you can see through the viewfinder again.
Okay, you probably missed that since it's very relatively quick. I'm going to run through that one more time. We're going to see the mirror come up. We're going to see the shutter come down, so-called first shutter, followed by the second shutter, and then the mirror will come back down again.
Now we're looking at the mirror, which is in front of the shutter. If I press down the button, the mirror flips up out of the way and temporarily blocks the viewfinder. Then the shutter comes down, whoosh. Now light is exposing on the sensor and then the shutter closes again, followed by the mirror coming back down so you can see through the viewfinder again.
Okay, why is that important? Well, all digital SLRs, and believe it or not, most mirrorless cameras have a mechanical shutter. Obviously, a DSLR has a mirror and the mirrorless doesn't. But once the mirror moves out of the way, we have blocked shutter called an unexposed sensor. And the exposure happens, as you saw a moment ago, when the first curtain of the shutter moves from the top down. So in Canons, they move from the top down. In Olympus, it moves from the bottom up. One of the most important things to understand is the time that the front curtain takes to traverse the sensor is 1/250th of a second. So in this case, we're seeing a partially exposed sensor. In this one, we have the fully exposed sensor. Now, the sensor is fully exposed when the shutter is fully open. And the shutter in a normal camera can stay open, if we're not on bulb, from about 30 seconds to 1/250th of a second. And during that time, the so-called sensor is fully exposed. So the fastest that the shutter speed can go in most cameras, believe it or not, is only 1/250th of a second. This is called the sync speed. And in most cameras, it's somewhere between 1/200th to 1/250th of a second, depending on the make or the model. Now you may say, well, my camera shoots much faster than that. And yes, it does. How do they do that? Well, in order to do that, the second shutter has to start dropping down. And here we can see the second shutter partially covering the sensor. And when the second shutter comes all the way down, the sensor is completely covered again. If we want 1/500th of a second, you can see in this case that the second curtain is on its way down, but the first curtain actually hasn't hit the bottom yet. This is what happens if we go to 2,000th of a second. This is what happens if we go to a 4,000th of a second. In fact, we have created a slit, and the slit is scanning the sensor. And here it is at 1/8,000th of a second. So it's really important that you understand that when we get above 1/250th of a second, the shutter is not exposed, is not completely exposed, but we have a slit that runs down and scans the sensor. It's a pretty clever trick, but that's how it's done. And here it is if we look at them all put in a montage. So why is that important? Well, for flash photography, the sensor must be completely exposed when the flash fires. Because you recall earlier on, I said that at full power, a flash will normally last 1/250th of a second. And so the shutter requires 1/250th of a second. And so up to 1/250th of a second, the flash will completely expose the sensor. But if the sensor is only partially exposed, such as in any one of these other photographs here, we get a phenomenon called banding. And that's that black line that's at the bottom of this photograph. You can see here, the model is exposed, but the bottom is not. So that's first curtain blocking. If we look at this series of photographs of a model, and in this case, by the way, the camera is rotated into the portrait mode. So the shutter is moving from left to right. And you'll see that when we get to the bottom row of 1/250th of a second, there's a slight blackening of the right-hand side. At 1/500th of a second, half the model's face is blacked out, and 1,000th of a second, she's almost completely covered. So what this is showing us is that under normal flash photography, we can't actually take a properly exposed photograph if the shutter speed is greater than 1/250th of a second. And that's a really important thing to remember, because in many of those areas where you run into problems, it may well be the case that you were trying to do it at a faster shutter speed. But what if I need to go to a faster shutter speed? Is that possible? Yes, it is. It's done, but we have to turn on something called high-speed sync. And in most flash units, there's a button on the back for that. High-speed sync works by continuously pulsing the flash for the full time that the sensor is exposed, and that's about 1/250th of a second. Unfortunately, continuously pulsing the flash means that the power output of the flash is significantly reduced. And depending on the shutter speed, that might be reduced to as much as 1/228th the power of a normal flash. Less power means less effective distances. So that could mean 5 feet or less. So that works good for portrait shots, but it's not too good for wildlife. And that's where the better beamer comes to the rescue. By the way, portrait photographers working outside with flash actually run into a slightly different problem, because they are restricted to a 1/250th of a second. So if you have to work at 1/250th of a second, you must turn the ISO down to around 100. And you're probably going to have to stop down the aperture to a 16th or a 22nd to restrict the amount of light coming into the camera. That's going to result in poor depth of field. So everything behind the subject will likely be in focus, which may not be what the photographer may want. So switching, if you're going to use flash outside, switching to high-speed sync solves this problem because there's much less light created. So now let's look at the importance of the flash duration and how it varies with power. I mentioned it earlier on. At a so-called 1-to-1 or full power setting, the flash duration is about 1/250th of a second. If you move down to 1/16th power, the flash duration is 1/6000th of a second. And if you go all the way to 1/128th power, you'll get 1/20,000th of a second. And the reason that it's important to know that is that the flash duration can be taken advantage of for so-called stop motion flash photography. And stop motion flash photography allows you to get wonderful shots like this. Some of you may have been present in the water drop workshop that Joe Shelton and Bob Richardson put on in December. Bob and Joe take some wonderful shots of water droplets. They're extremely talented photographers, and they did a wonderful job at the workshop. I hope they get to run it again. If you didn't get a chance to do it, it's a really terrific experience. So freezing motion requires, under any circumstances, requires a fast shutter speed and lots of light and possibly a high ISO. If you don't have those things, a great alternative method is to use flash. So if you start to remove most of the ambient light, then the duration of the flash, interestingly enough, becomes the effective shutter speed. So even though you're shooting at, say, 1/200th of a second in low light, if the flash illumination is 1/10,000th of a second, that actually becomes the shutter speed. It's really quite a clever technique. And this method works very well in studios and in up-close lighting. Doesn't work well for far away or outdoor shots, because the key thing is that the flash must overpower the ambient light. So for stop motion photography, you must have lots of light and you must have a quick flash. And that's the so-called trick to that photography. Another way of using flash photography for our benefit is taking advantage of something called front curtain sync or rear curtain sync. And it's an interesting thing. In front curtain sync, the flash goes off at the beginning when the front curtain is down. And in that situation, you illuminate the subject before the action happens. Alternatively, the camera can set off something called rear curtain sync. And when you do that, you illuminate the action after it's happened. And that's illustrated here on the two billiard balls. In one case, it's caught and its motion is tracked at the beginning. In the other case, the motion is tracked and the light is flashed and captures the ball at the end. Something that's much more common. So if we were to go to rear curtain sync, this is where the flash goes off at the very last moment. In this case, we're seeing the ballet dancer and her motion is frozen at the very end. Her earlier motion while the sensor is open is captured in that motion blur. But by setting off the flash at the end, we freeze her motion very nicely and capture the idea of her total movement. A very common way to use front and rear curtain sync is with automobiles. If you want to capture the motion of the headlights coming at you, you use front curtain sync. So the flash goes off at the beginning, captures the car, the sensor is open, the car actually moves forward, and the high beams create those two lights. The reverse happens if you use rear curtain sync, and that's where the sensor is open, the car moves through the scene, and the flash captures it at the end. So you can use either one of those to photograph automobiles very effectively. You've seen it in all kinds of magazines. Another area is freezing motions with multiple flash. In this case, the sensor is left open, is in a dark room, and the flash strobe fires multiple times, and you get creative images like this showing motion. So what about mirrorless cameras, and how does flash work with mirrorless cameras? Well, you may be surprised to know that mirrorless cameras, by and large, have three shutter systems. One is a mechanical shutter. Two is called an electronic front curtain. And three is called an electronic shutter. The electronic shutter is something that you otherwise know as live view in your camera. Let's take a look first at the mechanical shutter. And I'm going to use the Canon R3 as an example here. This is Canon's newest and best camera, and it in fact is a mirrorless camera. It has a standard so-called focal plane two-curtain shutter with no mirror. So it just is this standard shutter that we saw before, but there's no mirror. When it's using the mechanical shutter, it can have a maximum shutter speed of 1/8,000th of a second. It can take 12 frames a second. And the so-called sync speed, or the maximum speed with flash, is 1/200th of a second. So in this case, it takes the curtain 1/200th of a second to uncover the sensor. But if we go to its electronic shutter, we see something different. By the way, most video cameras use an electronic shutter, and as do other cameras, such as the Canon 1DX Mark III. In live view, it's recording at about 16 frames a second. The Canon mirrorless camera has an electronic shutter. With that electronic shutter, it can take 30 frames a second, a maximum speed of 1/64,000th of a second, which is amazing. And normally, by the way, cameras with electronic shutters cannot take flash. And the reason will become obvious in a moment. So when we use our mirrorless camera in electronic mode, flash doesn't work. The reason I have chosen to share with you about the Canon R3 is in fact that this is now the new exception. The new Canon R3 can do it, but with a maximum shutter speed of 1/180th of a second. And the reason is that this has new chips which can be read very quickly. And this will be the future of mirrorless cameras. So this is the first mirrorless camera that in fact can use a flash with electronic shutter. So how do we take advantage of the electronic shutter in a mirrorless camera? Well, there's a technique called electronic first curtain shutter. So the camera has a mechanical shutter, but the first curtain is already open before we push the shutter button. And when we push the shutter button, this actually turns on the sensor. So in fact, that's why it's called electronic first curtain. So the second curtain closes normally. The advantage of that is that there's no shutter shock at slower speeds. And with this so-called electronic first curtain shutter, we get 12 frames a second. And now we can get flash because it has a sync speed of 1/250th of a second. So in fact, the electronic first curtain shutter is a very good compromise for flash photography in mirrorless cameras, and it works very well. So let's talk about electronic shutters and how they work. I've shown a matrix here of 4 photographs in which the sensor is being scanned. So in the first one, the sensor is off. In the second photograph to the right, the first line of the sensor is being read. The third one, a further line down is being read, and the fourth one, a further line down is being read. So the key thing about electronic shutters is that each line of the shutter, of the sensor, I should say, is read line by line. And it's read, by the way, at about 1/8000th of a second. That's the shutter speed at which the line is read. But the speed at which the whole sensor is read is called the shutter rate. And believe it or not, that's only 1/15th of a second. So this means that in an electronic shutter, the sensor is actually on for about 1/15 of a second. But if we are going to shoot flash, flash duration is 1/250th of a second. So the flash won't be on for very long because it takes 1/15th of a second to read the whole sensor. That's how sensors are read. And as chips are getting faster and faster, that reading is becoming faster and faster. And that's what's happening in the new Canon. But mirrorless cameras will get better and better in the future. So one of the artifacts that we see in mirrorless cameras is an effect called rolling shutter. And so in a typical mirrorless camera, you can have a max speed of, say, 1/5 or 6,000th of a second. You could shoot 16 frames a second. But in fact, there is 1/15th of a second time between the recording of the top line of pixels and the bottom line of the pixels in your camera. And that's okay if nothing in the scene moves. So I'd like you to look at these two photographs. And first of all, look at the one in the right. It's taken at 1,000th of a second shutter speed with a mechanical shutter. And it's a tram or city metro. And you'll notice that the windows are straight. If we go and look at the photograph on the left, which is taken with an electronic shutter, you'll notice that everything is leaning to the left. So the top of the doors are off to the left and the bottom of the doors. And the reason for this is, in fact, that in the time that it took, the 1/15th of a second, it took for the sensor to scan, the train moved and it captured, in fact, the doors at the top later than the doors at the bottom. And I can tell this was taken with an Olympus camera because it's leaning to the left. Olympus, as I mentioned earlier, scans from the bottom up. So this phenomenon of rolling shutter can lead to some funky things. So here's an example of rolling shutter and some drones. I'd like you to look at the top left picture and the top right picture. There's a little bending in the propellers, you can see, not much. These are taken with a mechanical shutter and no flash. If we go down to the bottom pictures, which are taken with an electronic shutter, you begin to see some severe bending in the propellers. And the one on the right is pretty funky. The rolling shutter is getting some really unique images. If you photograph an airplane propeller, which is going pretty quickly, in the top photograph on the left, we have a mechanical shutter at 3,200th of a second. It freezes the motion. But the photograph on the bottom left and the bottom right, using electronic shutter, generates some really, really weird images. And it's strictly an artifact of how the camera sensor is read. So you may see some of these things in your photos with an electronic shutter, a mirrorless camera. Now, normally that's not going to come into play very much, but it does from time to time in photographs where things move. In this case, we have a basketball, and I'd like you to look at the top left photo, which is a mechanical shutter, and the basketball is nice and round. If you look at the one on the right, which is taken with a mirrorless electronic shutter, you'll notice that the ball is oval. If, on the other hand, you use an electronic front curtain shutter on the same mirrorless camera, you get a nice oval ball again. And I'd like to tell you that this is me on the golf course, but afraid it's not. But this is an example of how the golf club can apparently develop a bend in it. You see the one on the left is taken with a Canon Mark III, and the golf shaft has a severe bend in it. The one on the right is taken with the new mirrorless camera, the R3, and it has much less of a bend, although still does have. So what's the point of all of this? Well, the important thing is to understand that mirrorless cameras have rolling shutters, and mirrorless cameras have 3 shutter systems. It's important that you understand the limitations of your camera, that you experiment with each of the shutter systems, and to know that when you're using the electronic shutter, because it's very fast, you will be unable to use flash with it. But also that while we have rolling shutter, it's becoming less and less of an issue with each new generation of cameras. Here's an extraordinary photograph that I took about 15 years ago. And this is an example where a digital SLR has shown a rolling shutter. Here are 2 aircraft doing a flyby. And the aircraft on the right is clearly in front of the aircraft on the left. And we know that because the smoke is covering the wings of the aircraft on the left. But if you look at the back end of the aircraft on the left, you'll notice that the horizontal stabilizers, that's the tail, is about to slice in to the tail of the other aircraft. How could that be? If the aircraft on the right is in the front and the aircraft in the back and the aircraft on the left is in the back, yet this photograph clearly shows that the 2 aircraft are about to collide. In fact, they didn't collide. And the only thing I can put that down to is a rolling shutter effect, whereby by the time the shutter had traversed the sensor, it created an artifact. So my point is that we can get funky shots that sometimes defy logic, whether it's a mirrorless camera or a DSLR. Sometimes they can create unexpected results. Okay, so for mirrorless cameras with electronic shutters, there's one other thing that you need to be aware of, and that is so-called banding. And it's a problem with artificial light. And artificial lights usually have a flicker of 1/60th of a second to 1/220th of a second. And fluorescent and LED lights are the worst. So the top is a mechanical shutter. The bottom one, you can see dark banding occurring just below the lights, and there's less banding down below. Here's another example. There's no flash involved here. The mechanical shutter on the right at 1/500th, and when you use the electronic shutter, there's this green banding. Okay, last 3 slides. We're getting away from the shutters and back specifically to flash. One of the things I mentioned earlier on was about the importance of getting the flash off the camera so that you don't basically over flash the subject. One of the great techniques that you can use is bounce the flash off the ceiling. And when you do that with a nice white ceiling, you'll get wonderful diffuse light back on the model. Almost all flashes have this little white card that can be popped up when that happens. And that's the purpose of that, is to create a catch light in the model's eye. In addition to bouncing the light off the ceiling, one of the things that you can do is to bounce the light off an adjacent wall, and that can help to create shadows. Just remember that if the wall is colored yellow, your model will have a yellow tint, and if it's colored red, the model will have a red tint on also. But the point is, in order to get rid of that flash look, don't be afraid to bounce the flash off the ceiling. And because of this phenomenon called TTL or ETTL, the camera will keep the flash on long enough to give you a pretty good exposure. Another way we can use to improve the quality of the light and take that harsh, flashed look, that cold look of that model on the top left, is to add a gel to the flash unit. And that can really do great things to improve and warm up the subject, like the flash, the photograph on the right. I've included the photo on the bottom here to show you a great example of positioning a speed light or any other light for photographing models. It should be away, ideally to the side, and hopefully high if you can get it, such that it simulates the sun. In this particular case, they're using a very simple diffuser to create more diffuse and a bigger light source. But if you can get the light away from the camera and slightly and higher, it will create a much more natural look. Lastly, I'd like to just take a look at manual flash. This is an example of where you might use manual flash. You have a subject present in the evening for a sunset. The sun is going down. You would like to balance the light between the subject in the foreground and the nice lighting in the background. If you use ordinary flash, it will in fact cause the lighting at the back to basically disappear. You won't be able to balance it. But if you turn down the power of the flash, in this case to 1/32, you'll be able to just light the subject and allow enough daylight to come back in and give that nice background sunset. And in this particular case, you can see that the model is being lit from the side, from the right-hand side, and from a flash gun that's high up on the right side, just like in the image that I showed you a moment ago, because the shadow is on the left side of his face and the top of his head is lit. So for those shots that you want to get in the evening, where you want to balance the sunset and the model, you'll need to turn down the power and use manual flash. So in conclusion, flash is great, but it is a complex tool in photography. If you've been used to shooting in aperture priority mode and have suddenly gone on and added your flash speed light to your camera and then taken a photograph and have experienced that the photos didn't come out quite right, the chances are it was because the shutter speed was above that magic 1/250th of a second. If you're in doubt or get frustrated, turn on the auto mode in your camera. You'll be surprised how auto mode gives you really good flashed conditions. But it is very helpful to understand how the shutter works and how it makes the implementation of flash easier. Remember, in normal flash photography, the sensor is open for 1/250th of a second. For faster speeds than that, we use high-speed sync, but the flash intensity is going to drop off dramatically. And remember that the light intensity is going to drop off very quickly with distance. Doubling the distance will mean 1/4 of the intensity. And I've mentioned earlier, try to get the flash off the camera to give some shadow and depth to your subject. And also learn how to use manual flash. Most importantly, experiment and have some fun. Now, there's been an awful lot to digest in what I've shared with you tonight. And I've mentioned earlier that the presentation is available in a PDF, so you can see it and go through it. But if you'd like to see some very good video tutorials, I recommend that you go to fstoppers.com in their lighting section. They have some great stuff and you can learn stuff really quickly. So with that, I will close and I'll be very happy to take any questions. And I will give up my sharing.
Mute.
Hey, Sean.
Great presentation.
Hey, Sean, this is Jerry.
Hey, Jerry.
So the new thing coming out is a global shutter
The global shutter. Yes, thank you.
that exposes all the pixels at once instead of having the rolling exposure.
Uh-huh.
And from what I'm reading, it looks like it's going to make the high-speed sync a lot easier. Have you done any research into that, or are you still waiting to see what happens?
Yes. So Jerry is talking about a new kind of shutter that I didn't touch on because it's not really yet available. It's called a global shutter. And basically the way that works is all the lines of the sensor are read at one time. So currently processors are not fast enough. They have to read the sensor line by line by line. The new global shutter will read it all at one time. It turns out that global shutters are really only available in scientific instruments, big telescopes, and using very, very fast chips. However, they're now beginning to be introduced in high-end cameras. It'll probably be frankly 5 years before we will get global shutters available, because the speed of the chips to read those 8,000 lines has to be really fast. So they are the thing of the future, and it'll solve all those problems that I talked about. But we probably won't see it on affordable cameras for 3 or 4 years anyway.
Supposed to be.
Thank you, Jerry.
So, talk about having a lot to unpack. I think everybody should download the PDF, print it, and put it under their pillow for the next 3 weeks until we come to our next meeting in March. Other questions for Sean before we part company this evening?
I just have a comment that I've been trying to learn Flash, and I knew some of this terminology, but I didn't really understand it, Sean. And I loved hearing you explain it. You just did a great job, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz.
Absolutely great job. Anyone else?
I do have a quick question, I think, for a newer photographer who's not quite figured out what she likes to photograph. Is there kind of what recommendation would you make for your first flash or two for a DSLR?
Oh, depending on the camera. By the way, many people have a flash that flips up. It's self-contained flashes. Those are almost useless.
Exactly, yes.
Those things are just only good for photographing the kids in a small space. But you can buy flashes from B&H. There are some, if you buy a Canon flash or a Nikon flash, they may cost you $250. There are some Chinese or Korean-based flashes, and they're available for $70, $80 that look like and are equally good. Frankly, buy those because you can experiment with them. They're cheap, and they'll give you a pretty good flash power output, and it's worth doing. But forget about that little pop-up flash in the camera. The light output from that is basically just useless.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely found that out.
Other questions or comments?
They're all asleep, Max.
Yeah, I don't think so. No. I think they're still scribbling notes despite the PDF being available.
Hey, Sean, how much does it have to start to rain before you put away the flash?
Oh, quite a bit. Yeah, on a heavy storm, you'll see the rain, and the same thing in snow. It's useless in snow. Believe me, I've tried it.
But I've been watching some videos where photographers love the rain because it gives a cool background.
It can indeed, but the problem is you have to kind of see through it, but it can give a very nice effect.
Yeah.
Thank
Bill,
you.
Bill, did you have something you wanted to comment?
No,
Okay.
other than thank you, Sean.
All right.
Bill, great to
Anyone
see you.
else?
I'd say you did a great job. This is Joe. I love everything you give out on the Flash and all that explanation and everything. You're a lot better than some of these videos that I see.
Well, thank you, Joe. That's a big compliment. And thank you for the fantastic water drop workshop you did. I hope you'll do it again. That was really great.
Sure, I'll be happy to do it again.
Anyone else? Well, Sean, on behalf of the club, thank you so much. We're proud to have you as a member, and we're very appreciative of you giving us some of your insights and expertise. So thank you again. And for the rest who are on the Zoom, I think I will bid you all adieu.
And Max, congratulations on your first meeting.
All right, here we go. It will be a ride. Good night, all.
Good night. Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you again, Sean.
Good night.
Night.